It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, private investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, and just by emailing me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. Our archives you could find at Spreaker.com, and you can sign up there for free. You get an email notification anytime I put up new content. That's where I do a live show Friday nights, a live solo show, and there's also a chat room. But the most important thing is you can go to Spreaker.com and you can put in the name of our guest, Heather Braden. And she's been on 2 times previously because she's intimately connected with all these people in the news like Trump and Epstein and Jean-Luc Brunel. As a matter of fact, she was in a documentary in the United Kingdom in England called Is Trump a Sex Pest? She's the one that put me in touch with Barbara Pilling, who was actually hit on by Trump when she was a young teen. So Heather Braden is really tuned into all this stuff behind the scenes. Heather Braden, are you there?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. Remind the audience, who is Heather Braden? And just touch briefly on what we discussed the last couple of times you've been on the show.
Sure. I basically am a lifelong model. I started at age 14. I was started by being scouted by Eileen Ford and several other agencies at the time, and that was in the late 80s when I was 14. So I basically left and went to New York without my parents' permission, chasing this dream of what I'd seen in the, media. And I found my way there and was just kind of thrown into this world of these powerful predators. And I spent the next 15 years really modeling until I was about age 30, pretty full-time. And then I also, started as a photo assistant and ended up as a photographer and a producer down the line, and still a model. I'm still a model today, even though I am, doing different types of things than I was at that time. I still have agencies in several cities. And so obviously this really struck home because it's kind of been my lifelong, situation.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you a question now, because you talk about how you went to New York City when you were like 14, 15 years old. And you hear these stories, especially when I talked to the attorney that was suing a Trump modeling agency about that. I believe the girl was from Haiti. She was a teen girl from Haiti. Right. You know the story,
Yep.
right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And you hear that they have these studio apartments. Many of them were in the building owned by Jeffrey Epstein's brother, okay? Mm-hmm. And there would be like bunk beds in there with like 6 girls packed into one little tiny, and then they're overcharged for their rent and their FedEx and their limos and their makeup. Were you ever taken advantage of it that way?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. All of us were really. I mean, I spent years living in models' apartments in New York for multiple different types of multiple different agencies, and they were all the same. And usually, and of course, mind you, we're 15 and 14. We had no idea about anything in the world. And now, obviously, I do. But so we were living in these apartments. And in one situation, it's a 2-bedroom apartment. It was right by the World Trade Center. And there were 4 beds in one room. And there was 2 or 3 in another room. And they were all full at all times. And then in the living room, I actually was sleeping on the pull-out sofa. And at this point, I was a little bit older. And most girls, they come in and out of the system so fast, like 3 months or a year maximum. They're either, too distraught to continue, or they just can't hack it with their personalities, or worse things happen, like other, scenarios where they've been abused, or they just, so they're in and out. It's a super transient situation. And, but at this point, I was older, and I had stayed in New York. I didn't have anything to go back to, where I was from. So I kept living in models' apartments, because your option is either you live in a model's apartment or you get a rich boyfriend who then saves you from that world of the model apartment, or you just get a real job. And to do that in New York is so difficult. Most just don't. So those are kind of like the 3 routes that you go once you come to the New York So I lived in the models apartment extended times because I didn't want to do any of the other things, and that was my option. So I was one of the oldest at some point, and the new girls would come at age 12, 13, 14, 15. Most of the girls in the models apartments were minors, almost all of them, and then, you get a little bit older and you had boyfriends or you were working in the industry. And of course, as the young ones, you were also a target either way. But yeah, so I was living on the sofa bed, pull out, and 7, 8, 9 girls, teenagers. There was a lot of drama, a lot of crying, a lot of tears, a lot of drugs, and a lot of just drama with all this scenario. Most of the girls were foreign. Their passports were held by the agencies. Of course, it's under the guise of safety so that they didn't lose them in the event they had a last-minute job. But the reality is most jobs just weren't international for most girls at that point. So really that was probably part of their forced work, because you really couldn't, they also had you on a stipend every week. So you'd get, $50, $100 if you were good and you negotiated, maybe you could get $150 a week to live off of. Most of the time they made you advance that money. It was a loan.
Right.
And if you were lucky and you were doing some editorials, they paid almost nothing. So, you easily racked up a humongous debt with the agency. And yes, they charged $1,200, $1,800 a month for the right to live like that.
And this is the standard practice, Casablancas, Elite, Trump modeling agency, all these, this is how they do it. Yep. Okay. Because they're all following the exact same handbook because they all know each other.
Right. And in one sense, a lot of these agencies are running a legitimate side. So either way, it kind of benefits both angles, like your legitimate angle and your dirty business on the side, because you do need a place to put girls because they are advancing some money and or an opportunity, let's say. But the majority, the vast majority don't ever do much with the career. It's really, it's a numbers lottery game. So they just do it as cheap as possible. It's like racehorses. You just train 100 and see how many you have left in 6 months.
Yeah, and real quick, when I used to live in Vegas, and I used to talk about this on the air, that we had one of those model apartments in our condo complex.
No way.
Oh no, yeah, and the girls, and they used to look at me like, oh, the dad, hey, we got a flat tire, what do we do? They would come to me, and I was so naive though. I really didn't think them being taken advantage of, and I'd see them coming in with their boxes of wine. They'd buy boxes of wine every night, and but they were all over 20, that's for sure. And
right.
But the other thing, too, was just like you said, constant turnover. There was 6 girls living in this apartment constantly, the new one all the time. And in Vegas, there's a lot of trade shows and conventions. So I know they worked for that a lot, too. They did those jobs on the side, So, but remind the audience, so the last 2 times you were here, you were telling us about the documentary you were involved in in England about Is Trump a Sex Pest? So what kind of stories did you tell us back then? Because you're here today to tell us about Jean-Luc Brunel, who you worked for. Now, right, okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, and they're all tied in, but the Trump story was essentially one of my agents. It wasn't actually Jean-Luc Brunel's agency, but it was another agency that forced me to go to Trump's house under the fake guise that it was a client networking event that I was requested for because he had some, business and he was looking for models, and that was always kind of what it was. And I was essentially forced to go there under the threat of being sued or kicked out of my agency and sued. So, and that was where it was Trump and 50 girls and some A-list actors, 3 or 4 of them, and just preying on young girls, most of them Eastern Bloc, who didn't speak English, who were clearly probably minors. And, that was one of 1,000 similar type things that I've been forced to go to over the years.
Right.
And that was probably one of the last I was really forced to go to, forced, because I was a bit older already at that point.
And those A-list actors have never been identified?
No.
Haven't they been sort of?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I'm really, to be honest, I'm really frightened to talk about that because... And these guys were on the scene all the time in Miami. Even if you just Google model party Miami, 80 or 90s or 2000s and celebrities, you'll see the same guys popping up in the articles, and you'll kind of get the gist of who it was. because it's the same guys that were always there.
Gotcha.
And they were in the news for being there, but this was a more private thing.
Well, I'm sure you've been following the Jean-Luc Brunel story because how did you first come in contact with the man?
So when I was 14, Eileen Ford came to my little hometown in Oregon and had posted up signs. Somebody had posted up posters that she was looking for, she was scouting for models. Somehow I knew what that was from like Interview magazine. And I had done one hair show for a hair thing, and it was really fun.
Yeah.
I was 13 when I did the hair show. And so when she came into town, I went and met her, and she immediately offered me a contract, and I was in touch with her after that. Now, there were a couple other agents I met right around that time as well in my hometown. So, these people would go town to town looking. And so I ended up, remaining in contact with her. And she wanted me to go straight to Paris and set me up with a contract with Jean-Luc. I would go to Paris and live with him and go with Karin's Paris, which is a big deal because Karin's was a legitimate agency as well, and he was definitely a developer of models and careers. But, like the bodegas, there's the front and there's another world underneath it, and in his case anyway. And so, yeah, I was slated to go there to Paris with him. I was really excited because I wanted out of my little town. I had big ambitions to live all over the world. Specifically, I wanted to live in Paris more than anything. So, of course, that was the best, offer for me. And then just a few days before I went, a girlfriend of mine who'd just gone to Paris modeling, she was maybe a year or so older, about 16. And I don't know how, her parents must have obviously let her go and, arranged her passport and everything. And she came back, and, when I told her that I was going, and I couldn't believe she'd come back early, only 2 months later, she basically broke down in tears and ended up telling me the story about her agent, Jean-Luc, who had drugged her and raped her. Mm. And she'd woken up in his bed in the morning after being at the Club Bandouche in Paris and swore that the bartenders must have been in on it because she said she had the drink at the bar with him, and she wasn't a drinker. He was just kind of forcing her to have a drink. And so she had only drank, she said, about half of the drink. And she was 16, she wasn't a party girl. And sure enough, she woke up on the bed tied up with scarves the next morning and left and came running home. That's what you would do. You would just go running home to your parents. Mm-hmm. And so that was it. She was out of the industry, and it really echoes the other girl, his victim, I forget her name now, Thaishia, who has been the main victim of his in the Paris situation. It's been going on. And it's a very similar story to hers. She had just been there, and same thing basically happened. So I knew his name, and I was absolutely terrified. That's really the first story I'd really ever heard about somebody raping somebody. I didn't really know a lot about that. And so I was pretty terrified, and I was on alert. And to my mind, I was like, okay, I'm never going to Paris with this guy, Jean-Luc. Mm. But, I just kind of figured he's like one out of, hundreds and hundreds, and he's just the one bad apple. But so I went to New York, and I went with another agency because I basically blew off Ford Models because she kept saying I had to go to Paris and I had to go with Jean-Luc. And this was, I don't remember if it's just before or when that 60 Minutes episode came out, American Girl in Paris, which was all about Eileen Ford and Jean-Luc and these other allegations, and girls like Courtney Powell who'd already made allegations against him. And it was right at that time. I'd have to double check the date, see if it was right before or right after. I think it might have been right before. But obviously Eileen Ford had already heard these allegations. She was already aware of the stories. Now, I know she was a very professional woman, but I think, a lot of them, people just turned a blind eye to the stories because, there's also a legitimate side. So, but it was well known among models, over the next years. And for the next 10 years, as I tried to avoid Jean-Luc, the irony of it all is everywhere I went, there was Jean-Luc. He ended up being my agent on 3 different occasions by accident. The last time he was my agent was only a few years ago, which was MC2 in Miami, and I knew he had started it, But I just presumed at this point, to be honest, because of his age and his party lifestyle, that he was either passed away or retired, like many of these guys. And when I found out during the beginning of the new Epstein trial that he was in fact still the partner in MC Miami, which was my main agency, I resigned and I left right away. I didn't really tell them why. I just said that for reasons I can't really, I just can't be with the agency right now. Now, of course, since then, they had a lawsuit and then they split up and he sold his stake in MC2 with Jeff Fuller, who was the other partner down there, who doesn't necessarily know the dealings of what Jean-Luc really does in his free time. But, so they went on and parted ways. And that was just a couple years ago. So that's how long he's been haunting my life, and worse is that in between all that is many things that have happened, many incidences with him. He's groped me over the years and attempted things. And as well, he's the guy who took me as a gift to Harvey Weinstein.
Oh, really?
He essentially, at one point in Miramax in New York, he basically took me aside and said that this was through my agency. He was always in the agency because he was an investor. So he was always there when he was in town. That's where he was. He was hanging out. And I knew who he was, obviously, at this point, and I knew all the stories about him. I wish, girls, all kinds of girls would talk about him. And I'd heard about the 60 Minutes thing, but, back then you couldn't really see something like that. And he said that basically, because he was my agent and that was my world, although I knew these stories about him, there wasn't anything I could really do. It never occurred to me I could maybe go to the police or something for things. But, these men were so powerful, you wouldn't have dared.
Yeah, it seems like even, since by the way, I've had two guests and friends of mine, just like yourself, who were connected to Weinstein. It's just amazing how that guy got around.
Interesting.
Yeah, right, but what do you call I forgot what I was going to say there.
About Jean-Luc in the agency?
No, wait a second. It's such a serious allegation, a rape,
Right.
And even when I've tried to do shows about the modeling business before and contacted even people who wrote books, and you'd think they'd want to promote that book. But, it seems like people are getting paid off not to talk.
Right. I think people are just really afraid, possibly, is more. I mean, even, because, even myself, anyone and everyone I've asked to speak about it. I have personal friends that have been drugged and raped by Jean-Luc and other worse scenarios with Trump and other things. And they were just absolutely terrified. Terrified of also of even just potential lawsuits against them. Their parents, they are, a lot of the girls, that I never realized, to be honest, I went into counseling during COVID because I didn't really realize, the trials of Epstein and stuff and the whole Jean-Luc thing brought up a lot of anxiety for me and almost like an obsessive researching of me trying to track him because I wanted more than anything to see Jean-Luc pay. And he was still alive and still operating in Paris and right out in broad daylight. And his victims and I, we chatted and others that I've spoken to and I've tried to get to talk who won't talk. And, everyone else, a lot of people just are like lackadaisical and I think they're partially shamed because they participated so long. And one of the things I realized during counseling was that, one, that I was a victim, even though I never knew that, ironically, because even though it was groping and sexual harassment, I never thought of it as that because I hadn't been raped and I had managed to avoid being raped, and because of just sheer luck, to be honest, because I was in all the same positions, but I was alerted of him. And so,
that's interesting. You say that you didn't see yourself as a victim because, these are the kind of lawsuits that I do, and so often, and sometimes it's just so damn clear cut, like I have this one survivor right now. She has a huge case, but all she keeps saying is, "Well, I don't see myself as a victim." I guess you don't wanna,
right?
You know what I mean? Because that's another loss, It's so in your head, all this stuff. But I got a couple of questions for you. I got a couple of questions for you. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
Couple of questions.
It's so common, too, to be in this world. It was daily, so it seems so normal.
Right. Now, Jean-Luc Brunel, he would visit Jeffrey Epstein when Jeffrey Epstein was being held at that hotel jail at the sheriff's down there, where he was allowed to leave during the day. Jean-Luc Brunel visited him more times than there were visiting days. So either he was allowed there on a day where there wasn't a visit scheduled, or he went visited twice in one day. Who knows? Now, why would he be visiting so much? Were they still trafficking in the trafficking business partnerships during that period of time?
I mean, I'm sure. I mean, that's my personal opinion. But the thing is that I see Epstein was a client of Jean-Luc. You know, Jean-Luc is really the linchpin in this 40-year saga of trafficking teen girls around the world. And as far, I mean, obviously trafficking happens all over the world all the time, but on this kind of a level, I don't think it's ever happened until him. And he did it for 40 years. And I think that Epstein, you know, obviously started out as one of Jean-Luc's clients, and then it morphed into some sort of symbiotic business type relationship between them, where I think Epstein must have had those bigger other connections globally, whereas Jean-Luc was incredibly established among very powerful people in Europe and in Paris, and had been long supplying them there. But when he met with Epstein and they began working I think it just expanded, and obviously that must be how Jean-Luc came to New York. And I know that's how that Epstein was his investor and gave him, you know, about $1 million to do that, or $1 million line of credit, as they say. And, you know, I was right there in New York when Karin's New York opened. I know many models that were with Karin's New York, and he invited me to go with Karin's New York. He tried to pinch me from, it was, I believe, Next Model, and he was an investor at Next Models as well. And supposedly from what I've read, because, you know, at the time I didn't really know what their business was, but supposedly he and his brother were co-founders of Next New York, which was with Faith Cates, this woman. And I don't know, you know, the details on that, but that is prior to his business dealings with Epstein and Karin Models New York. But obviously they all knew each other, and that's how, you know, that came about. I forgot the original question.
Well, let me ask you a question now. My understanding is that Brunel had the access. He was the expert with the visas.
Yes. I mean, they all did it, but nobody's done it as much as I saw Jean-Luc doing it. But they all did it. The ones that were internationally focused, it was so easy to do the visas. I watched them do it in the office. I've seen Jean-Luc doing it in the office because, you know, when you're modeling and you're going on castings all day and you're between castings, and if you've got an hour or two to kill and you've got nowhere else to go and you're near your agency, well, then you would just go to your agency and hang out. And on top of it, you know, you're kind of right in their face. You're fresh in their mind. They might take a shine to you. A job might pop up, and you're the one sitting in front of them. You know, and they can have the power to push you to clients and things like that. So, you know, you'd be in the agency, and I was very interested in photography and Photoshop, which was relatively, you know, new. And I, you know, which is what I later went into, is photography and, you know, all of that. And so I would sit there for hours and watch them. They had in-house graphics people that would be doing, you know, whatever they wanted. And I would watch them doctor up and make fake editorial tear sheets. And I sat there asking, like, well, what are you doing? How are you, you know, I'm very inquisitive, and I was very interested. Yeah, and they'd sit there and they'd tell me what they were doing. We'd sit around giggling and watching as they created fake tear sheets. And then I even saw... In
order to qualify for the visas.
Exactly. And I watched them even filling out the visa paperwork, submitting the documents. I remember one of them specifically telling me how many you had to have in order to get that H-1 visa. And I don't remember if it was 12 or 20 tear sheets. You know, when you're talking about a teenage girl from Latvia or whatever, they don't have tear sheets. They can't get tear sheets because they're too young and they just haven't been in the industry long enough. And Latvia doesn't have that many magazines, because in order to qualify from wherever you're from, your home country or whatever that is, you would have to have proven that you are a substantially, you know, established working talent, model or whatever, sports, and you've been written up because of it in so many magazines. And so that's what you're basing it on. And so they would show all these published editorials, supposedly, that shows how, you know, established they are, but none of them were.
You know something? This is fascinating. I've never heard this explained to me this way before. I was told that Mr. Trump, the majority of his H-1 visa applications was of all his businesses, the golf courses, bringing in Irish construction workers, all this other stuff, because he does import a lot of foreign workers, but that the majority of his H-1 visa applications was for Trump Modeling Agency. Okay?
Of course.
And now that we know, this is systemic visa fraud, okay, trafficking children, that this is government documents, it's available to be researched. And you want to know something else? I brought this up once before, and I was shot down about this as part of a litigation we were working on, that I specifically said, this is where we need to be looking into. So it's very interesting that you shared this with me, Heather. Our guest today, Heather Braden, you could find her at her website, heatherbraden.com, and also on Twitter or Instagram at Heather Braden, or sometimes it's Heather J. Braden. So you can try both until you find her. She's going to be the prettiest one, so it's easy to find, right? We can find that easy, Heather Braden. So I left the audience with a little teaser about Steve Mnuchin. What do you know about Steve Mnuchin? His name shows up on some paperwork. He says, oh, my goodness, I can't imagine why. What do you know?
I mean, I was with Next Models, and he was listed as, on there as their official state point of contact for Next Management Corporation. Now, when you fill out that paperwork, first of all, as a business, as Faith Cates would have, or whoever it was at the time, you don't just randomly pick some random number by accident. Now, granted, they've been longtime friends, so, obviously at some point, she asked him to be that person, clearly. And any other story around it is ridiculous, because who would just accidentally put somebody's information? And ironically, I believe the address that was used for that point of contact was the office for Next at the time. And I was with Next Models at that time. I was with them. He was there frequently. I saw him frequently at the office. To me, and I remembered him only from his face, because I remember thinking he was this weaselly, creepy, leering guy, right, who was often at the dinner parties, the model parties. He was one of what I considered to be what we call the model blanks, the F word. We call them the model effers. Right. That was their known word in the industry. If you ask anyone in the industry what is a model effer, they'll all tell you it's one of these creepy, usually powerful or rich guys hanging around the teen girls at the model parties. And so, he was there. I've seen him many, many times. He was around the agency all the time. He was just a fixture. Obviously, he wasn't there every day, day to day, because I don't think he actually worked there. But he was definitely there. And supposedly, Next Management was supposedly formed in '88, from what I read. And I'm not sure the exact dates, but that was just before I got to New York. But and supposedly it was by the brothers, Jean-Luc Brunel and Arnaud Brunel. So I'm sure, at that time, Jean-Luc had already been part of the 60 Minutes episode. So obviously Faith Cates knew this, because she was in the modeling industry in New York, and everyone in the modeling industry in New York knew this. It was a big, humongous deal that Eileen Ford was in 60 Minutes, which was, of course, like the biggest news show at the time, because she'd been sending girls to this guy who was a known predator, who'd been accused by multiple girls of drugging and raping at least 3 girls. And so when Faith Cates decided, basically, that she didn't give a flying F, excuse my language, and decided she doesn't care what they said. She's going to take this guy who has this reputation, she's going to partner with him and create a new agency. So she had no problem doing that. If she had no problem doing that, well, then what would give her any problem lying about her relationship and history of this, what's his name?
Steve Mnuchin.
The Treasury.
Yeah, Steve Mnuchin. Now, have you looked into his wife? Because his wife, he definitely married up. Okay, he married out of his league, even for a rich guy. Okay, have you looked into her?
I'm sure. Who knows? I might even know her. I'm sure. Yeah. He's got two ex-wives. There's this one girl, Heather Forrest Crosby. It looks like, I don't know who she is. It says that she was an entrepreneur. And then the Louise Linton. It doesn't surprise me, of course, the opportunistic moves of people goes both ways. And I don't blame anyone for marrying up. I'm not from the highest class of family, although my English family and my both ancestors all were very successful, and even in fashion and arts and things. But, I can't blame anyone for necessarily marrying up. But it's definitely something that was probably introduced through this world, because I doubt he would have had direct contact with a Scottish actress otherwise.
Right, yeah. Every beautiful young lady I meet, I always advise them to marry well. Go to college and marry well.
Right. Well,
there's no shame in that. There's no shame in that whatsoever.
Right. Well, and being the mother of 2 children, and I clearly I've married the wrong person, and I went for love, and I married somebody who was broke, and somebody who I loved, and it went really sour. It did not work for me. So,
and you know what, too, man? A lot of these rich guys are nice guys, man. There's places in Manhattan where rich guys hang out, and these guys are the biggest schlubs, menches. They're like menches, they call them, nicest guys in the world, and they'll treat you like a queen, man. There's no reason not to do that. But let's get back to Jean-Luc Brunel, rather than giving out a romantic advice from the Opperman Report.
Yeah.
Okay, which
That's another episode.
I'm clearly unqualified to do. Have romantic advice. So let me ask you this.
Myself as well. I'm in the same boat with you.
I know. Let me ask you this now. What Jean-Luc Brunel, what he was facing, explain to us, because I haven't been following it that closely. Everyone's jumped on the bandwagon here, so I pretty much taken a step back. I'm working on other things like we discussed before.
Right.
What was he being charged with, and do you personally know the survivors that he was accused of?
I have chatted with a lot of the survivors the moment that the Epstein case kind of started going, because I reached out to them because I knew that I know people also. So I was trying to kind of unite them and hoping that there would be some sort of, quote unquote, Me Too fashion that would happen, and a cascade would open and everybody would take him down, because he's been my nemesis my whole life. And I've, tried to avoid him, and he's always there, and he's destroyed lives around me, and he's stolen money from all of us. And so I was trying to kind of, we were definitely in contact. We were discussing where he was, and I was kind of following along with all of them while this was preliminarily. Then he was arrested, I forget now, I think 2020, for rape and under investigation in Paris, and he was being held, and of course it was COVID. And so they were, I guess, looking for additional, I'm not so familiar with the French. What I know now, because I didn't really realize this till the other day, was they'd put out calls looking for other victims. But of course, in the media, I never saw anything of that really here, to be honest. Even Virginia Giuffre actually put out a plea looking for others to substantiate what she saw. And ironically, I only saw that yesterday for the first time. I somehow missed that, because there's so much going on. And about 3 weeks ago, I actually consulted with lawyers in New York, because I realized that, through my counseling stuff, that I was also even a victim of his, although I wasn't, a rape victim. I was definitely a sexual assault victim. And so, and even as a minor. So when I spoke to them and consulted with them, all of them, because I realized, because part of the reason that his case was stalling is because they needed more people. And then also the Paris laws, obviously if there was New York victims, they could potentially extradite him, and he could really be taken, into the New York system. And that was my goal, was to try to find somebody in the New York world, because he had the agency for years. He was in New York for many, many years, and everyone talks about him in Paris and what he did in Paris. But there's hundreds of victims that happened in New York, and they either haven't seen it or they're too afraid of it. They can't come forward yet. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe I should just go, since I am a sexual assault victim, go to a lawyer and go ahead and take out a case in New York. This was about 3 weeks ago. And I finally consulted, and they told me that during the Epstein trial, they extended the statute of limitations in New York.
Yeah.
But what I did not know is that they removed them in August or the end of 2021. So I missed it literally by a few months.
Okay. There's ways to get around that, okay? We'll talk about that off the air. I want to ask you about, once again, back to Trump Modeling Agency and the Fashion Cafe. What do you continue to tell us about the Fashion Cafe in Manhattan? The gentleman that ran the place then was indicted for stealing billions or whatever it was. Then went to work for Trump. He went to run Trump Modeling Agency, and then Trump gave him a pardon. What can you tell us about all that?
Are we talking about Francesco Butti or Tommaso Butti? Because there's the two of them. I think they're brothers, the two of them. And, of course, I remember that. I was there at the opening. I mean, I wasn't really obviously on that level, because that was the supermodels. And I'm trying to remember who it was that was dating them. I want to say that one of those guys I feel like one of them married someone that I knew, or maybe I just remember hearing. So I wasn't really privy to what was really going on, but he went to run which one? Trump Models, right?
Yeah, Trump Model Agency. Yeah.
Yeah.
After
that guy was
after the criminal charges. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course. I mean, that doesn't surprise me whatsoever. I mean, it's just. I mean, honestly, yeah. I mean, we need to have like a massive flow chart. We really need to create like a wall-sized flow chart because it's so complicated to like track all these things. But yeah, of course. I mean, that guy was a known. I can't remember which one's which because I know it was two brothers basically. But it was. I mean, the guys, they were just scumballs. They were such.
What about Anthony Scaramucci? Did you ever run across Anthony Scaramucci? Because wasn't there a period of time where he owned a bar or a restaurant that was like a sugar daddy kind of joint?
I'm not so sure. We're talking about. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me. Let me think. Now I'm trying to remember what his face looks like. Oh yeah.
No. Okay.
Yeah, I don't know too much about him, but I'll tell you if I know the name of the restaurant. Was that in that time in there?
Yeah, it was all during that time period too. And he was a pro-Trump guy. Trump made him communications director, and he lasted like 3 days. Yeah, and but no one talks about his background as running this. I forget what they called it.
What was the name of the restaurant?
A sugar bit.
Right now.
I don't remember.
Is that what the name of it was? No.
I don't remember what the name was. But the thing is, there was another guy there who was sort of a private investigator and a security expert. He calls himself, who was he used to run the place, and then he became a security expert after 9/11. He's running out all over the place.
I'd love to know what his what the name of that restaurant was.
What about back to Brunel? Okay, now.
Yep.
What do you make of this? Was he? You know the guy, right? It's a drastic life change to wind up from running around for parties and runways and fashion shows to sitting in a jail cell awaiting maybe a 20-year life, to life sentence. Do you think he's the kind of guy that, in a situation like that, would kill himself or?
I mean, I definitely think it's 50-50.
Yeah.
I would take it go either way on that. I mean, of course, absolutely. This guy lived life at the top of the heap. I mean, jet-setted the world with with the most beautiful women and girls, and just did some of the most lurid things. And there was massive drugs for years. I mean, yeah, he could do anything he wanted. To be put from there, where you think you're untouchable into a cell, of course, I wouldn't doubt anything. Plus, he knows what he did. He knew he's guilty for everything, and 1,000 times worse. And I'm going to tell you a little story about him that, I can't substantiate it because it was just myself. And obviously, even if I could, most people I know won't talk. They're just too frightened, And I'm actually working right now. I've reached out to a lot of people to see if anyone will corroborate anything that I've said so that I can, go to a mainstream national. I've spoken to some people at NBC and Miami Herald and the BBC again, but obviously they want somebody to corroborate this particular story I'm going to tell you. But who's going to corroborate that? There's no one around now. So, okay. But at one point, one of the things that I've seen, and I've told people about this before in other interviews and things, I was slated to go. People were always trying to get me to be in the movies, even though I wasn't really an actress because I didn't have the confidence. I love it now. I wish I'd done that. But so I was given the opportunity to be in this movie, and of course it was some low-budget production about a sex addict, so it was going to have 9 sex scenes in it. And I just didn't feel comfortable. Although, if it had been shot by David Lynch or, Quentin Tarantino, it would have been an incredibly edgy movie, and it would be probably great. But the person who was doing it did not come across like that and was totally unknown. He was an Eastern European guy. He kind of had this, faked French name. It was something like, I don't remember. It was not Jean-Luc, but it was something like, something like that. But he ended up confessing to me that he was from Eastern Europe, and I can't remember from where. And he was a very charismatic and pretty good-looking older guy. And he was very energetic, and he was actually pretty straightforward with me. And to this day, I will say that I do think that he was probably one of the most honest scumbags that I've ever met. But at the time, so I'd been introduced to him. He was determined that I was the one for his movie. There was just no way around it. And it was just, that's it, you're doing it. And I hadn't agreed to it, but it was like, you're going to do it. And I hadn't signed contracts yet. But anyway, he was trying to, schmooze me and get me to trust him. And he really wanted to make a real legit movie, I think. But he asked me to house sit for him while he was going to Europe to go work in Europe, wherever he was going. And he had this big loft in Soho, and I lived in this cramped apartment with 10 girls or whatever. So he wanted me to house sit and take care of his little poodle for 6 weeks. So I said, okay. And I went down there to meet with him once to check out the place. And he showed me around, and he ended up showing me all of these porno movies that he had produced. They were soft porn, and they were, but that was still, in Eastern Europe, soft porn was not American soft porn. So it was a little bit more medium level. And, I was like, whatever. I really wanted nothing to do with the guy. But he, it was a good place to stay, and he wasn't going to be there. So I came back a few days later to get them. Mind you, I'd seen him many times during the month previously with my agent and all this stuff. And so I came by to get the keys the night on the eve he was leaving. And when I got there, Jean-Luc was there. So it was me, Jean-Luc, and this guy. And most times I'd ever seen Jean-Luc was always at a party, at a dinner, at the agency. I'd never seen him kind of quietly one-on-one. And, he saw me, oh, hey, how are you, my darling? He knew my face vaguely, but that was it, And they were sitting there chatting, and this guy introduced me as the model, the actress for his movie. And Jean-Luc was like, oh, my God, wow, you're going to be a big star, blah, blah, blah. And he ended up, but what I figured out and that evening was that Jean-Luc and him were going together. And they were traveling to Eastern Europe together. And Jean-Luc told me that he was scouting and that they were scouting together. And that this guy, who I thought was nothing more than a producer, was somehow entangled and connected with the agency and was now on his way with Jean-Luc to go scout in Eastern Europe. And, of course, those were all the red flags. Jean-Luc scouting Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. I knew that there was more to that than just looking for the next top model. So when he left town, initially I didn't look around too much, but I decided to start snooping, and I decided to go through his office. And he had this wall of shelves, an entire massive wall, and there were these matching binders. They were white. They were probably at least 6 inches thick. They were the thickest binders that you could buy, and there was dozens and dozens and dozens, and they were all on this entire wall, and they were all categorized and labeled and organized like a library. And so I pulled one off, and I opened it up, and I started looking at it. And each and every page and chapter was actually, it was broken down by village, and
wow,
by alphabetical. And I could tell it was a village name because although I didn't speak any Eastern European languages, I could see that there was it just clearly said, and I could see the word like Czechoslovakia or like the abbreviations and the town, and then I would open it up, and alphabetically there were these clear plastic sleeves, and each book must have had hundreds of girls in each book. Each section, each village would have like 20, 30, 40, 50 girls, and they were topless. Some of them were fully naked. Some of them had handwritten notes with little stars scribbled in with pens, phone numbers, contact information, where they were, ages. I could see the ages because it would be, in French, and it was clearly somebody's handwriting in French, and it was, 12, 13, 14, 15, all the way up to 19, 20, but the ones with the stars and the notes and the handwriting were all teenage girls. And so it occurred to me, obviously, and I started pulling more of these books down, and they were all the same. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. And obviously we'd whispered about these things for many years. So when I actually saw it, that was there was no doubt, obviously, that's what these guys were doing. And, of course, at the time, being a dumb young model and not really having, I had a camera, but, with film in it, but it just didn't occur to me to take a picture of this.
Yeah.
And I was too afraid. I told a couple friends probably, and I, we kind of would have grossed out and laughed it off. And of course, at the time, I thought these girls were doing this on purpose, but they were sluts, that they would do anything to get out of their village, like how pathetic of them. But I didn't know, obviously, these girls were destitute and desperate and being preyed upon, and that this was their one way out of their pig farm, in eastern Latvia, or wherever it was. So I had no idea, I just, obviously how I looked at it was totally different. So I didn't think a whole lot about reporting it, for example.
Let me ask you a quick question, because we've only got about 2 minutes left, so really quick. John Casablancas. Mr. Trump signed up his daughter, 13 years old, to John Casablancas' elite modeling agency. Were you familiar with Casablancas, and what do you make of the... He had an incredible reputation along these lines. What do you make of that whole scenario?
Well, you know, I mean, I knew him. Everybody knew him. And, of course, you know, Trump's daughter would have been untouchable for him no matter what. He wouldn't have dared with Trump to do anything. I'm sure Trump just wanted his daughter to be a model because, you know, it gives him clout. You know, he loves that. So, you know, beauty is everything, and you're only judged and qualification is your beauty. In general, you know, in society, you're rated kind of by men's attention and your beauty. So, of course, you know, for him, that's just like a notch on his belt, I think. I mean, that's my personal opinion. John Casablanca was, I think, a dirtbag, but like the rest, he had a legitimate business as well, and, you know, I mean, Jean-Luc is by far the worst. He's by far the top of the crop. He's worse than all of them. This went on for 40 years. It was known about. These agents knew it.
Real quick, other famous names that are connected to Jean-Luc that we would recognize? You just want to list them off?
Yeah. There's a lot. First of all, if anybody looks up something called Marlowe Press, and you can see the old head sheets in their archives of the supermodels and the regular models that were listed for every model agency throughout history that company, Marlowe Press, ever produced. They produced them in Paris and in New York, and now they had an archival site last time I saw that had headshots from Karen's Paris that lists many people on that list. There's Monica Bellucci was a model there. Mila Jovovich was a model there. I believe Carrie Otis was a model there. Then there's tons of other girls. There's tons of girls on there that nobody knows where they are. And now they may or may not have seen anything. And, of course, you know, he knows who he's picking and choosing. Not everybody has that experience with Jean-Luc. Some people are going to think Jean-Luc is the most amazing guy because he made their career and treated them like a queen because he knew he was going to make them a star and make money. You know, and then the others.
Heather, real quick, the thing to investigate here is the visas. It's government documents,
100%.
and they can be pulled up with FOIA requests. Every one of these people, all of these agencies importing these young girls, we need to have a congressional, nationwide, locating every one of these kids and find out where they are today. Heather Braden,
100%.
HeatherBraden.com. You can find her on Twitter and Instagram, also too, at either Heather Braden or Heather J. Braden. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.